They told the people he was recovering that the young king, though a little pale, remained in good spirits, that he had taken food, given orders, whispered prayers. But inside Greenwich Palace, behind the heavy drapes and perfumed walls, a different story unfolded, one that no proclamation could polish, no portrait could hide, and no priest could sanctify. The stench of decay, sharp and unmistakable, had begun to seep under the velvet-lined doors weeks before Edward VI's death was announced. It clung to the tapestries, made the guards light rosemary in copper bowls, and forced the Queen's ladies to gag behind silk handkerchiefs, soaked in vinegar. There was no mistaking it anymore. This was not a boy on the mend. This was a king decomposing from the inside out. What was found inside his body after death would shock even those hardened by the brutal medicine of Tudor England. His lungs, once the instruments of royal speeches and whispered prayers, had liquefied into bloody sponge. His liver crumbled at the touch, discolored and disfigured beyond recognition. His heart, that sacred emblem of royal strength and divine appointment, had swollen grotesquely and was riddled with lesions. The body, when opened for embalming, it was no longer a corpse in the traditional sense. It was a battlefield of decay, a biological catastrophe too far advanced for even the most seasoned physicians to process. And so they sealed him in lead. Not once, but twice. Then wood, then lead again. The reason wasn't piety. It was fear. Fear that the gases would cause the corpse to rupture. Fear that the fluids would seep through the floors. Fear that someone might see what Tudor power had produced and let rot. But to understand this end, this grotesque collapse of flesh and function, you have to understand the obsession that brought him into being. For Edward was not just a son. He was the answer to decades of royal despair. Henry VIII had reordered the kingdom for a male heir. He had broken from the Pope, executed wives, burned friends, rewritten law and scripture and bloodlines alike, all to secure a legacy that would outlive him in the form of a boy. And in October of 1537, when Jane Seymour finally delivered that boy after more than 30 hours of excruciating labor, it seemed as though heaven had relented. Bonfires lit the capital. Bells rang in every village. Poets sang of Troy restored. Henry wept, and Jane died 12 days after Edward was born. His mother was gone, struck down by childbed fever, before she could enjoy a single hour of peace. Her death cast a pall over the celebrations. But to Henry, it was a fair exchange. The long-awaited heir had arrived. From the start, Edward was treated not like a child, but like a sacred object, a relic, a fragile miracle to be defended at all costs. His nursery was scoured with vinegar daily. The walls were scrubbed with lime water. No one entered without being inspected for health. Every morsel of food was tested by 3 tasters. Those who approached him had to wash in rosewater. And during plague seasons, entire rooms of the palace were closed off to protect him from air itself. But in this cocoon of caution, Edward's body was denied the very thing it needed most exposure: adaptation, immunity. His childhood was spent in isolation. No playmates, no dirt, no scratches or bruises or bruising antibodies. He was never allowed to fall, and so he never learned to fight back. And the irony was cruel. The protections that were meant to shield him were quietly killing him from within. By the age of 4, the cracks had begun to show. A fever left him bedridden for weeks. His appetite faltered. A rash appeared and disappeared without cause. Court records described his illnesses in euphemism. But behind the scenes, the royal physicians sworn to secrecy began to fear the truth. The heir was weak, not temporarily unwell, not passing frailty, but fundamentally vulnerable. His tutors noted that he tired easily during lessons, that he became feverish after short rides, that his skin paled, and his hands shook. At 7, He had survived 3 separate serious illnesses. But the damage lingered. He remained slim, easily exhausted, and unable to digest anything but the blandest of foods. But none of this reached the public. Portraits painted him robust. Speeches proclaimed his vigor. The Tudor myth machine, forged under his father, had no use for reality. And then, at Nina, the myth was crowned. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Edward ascended the throne as King of England. The coronation, grand in appearance, was scaled back in practice. The boy could not stand for the full ceremony. The weight of the crown gave him headaches. Parts of the procession had to be completed with him seated in a litter, yet the records declared him solemn, composed, and strong. The paintings captured the costume, not the child. Behind palace walls, a frantic apparatus took shape. His uncle, Edward Seymour, newly named Lord Protector, oversaw detailed instructions for how to position Edward during appearances so he wouldn't faint. Artists were instructed to depict him upright and confident. Duplicates were arranged for when Edward could not appear in person. Meanwhile, the king himself grew thinner, bally, and more skeletal with each passing month. Still, the proclamations kept coming. Edward's intellect was praised, his speeches reprinted, his reforms announced, but inside the body politic, as inside the boy himself, something had begun to fail. He coughed blood. His growth slowed. His bones ached. By the age of 12, his belly had begun to swell strangely, while his limbs remained thin as twigs. He could barely walk across a hall without stopping for breath. His face took on a ghostly pallor. His voice became hoarse. His bedding had to be changed several times a day, soaked in sweat, and the court, instead of offering rest, offered more ceremonies, more expectations, more signatures. He was no longer just a king. He was a symbol, a vessel, and eventually a lie. By 1552, the crisis could no longer be contained. The coughing fits returned with vengeance. His joints inflamed. His breathing grew labored. The boy king, once propped up as a Protestant savior, could barely hold a pen. But that didn't stop the men around him from placing important documents in front of him and demanding he try. Most infamous of all was the device for the succession, a legal document meant to alter the line of inheritance, bypass his Catholic sister Mary, and install Lady Jane Grey. Edward's name is on the document, but by then, his hands were so swollen that he could barely scrawl his initials, let alone sign in full. The signature degrades line by line, the final scrawl barely legible. It wasn't politics, it was theatre, and the lead actor was dying. But even now, we haven't touched the worst of it. The last months of Edward's life were not just a period of sickness, they were a descent. His skin erupted in sores. His fingernails fell off. His hair came out in clumps, revealing a scalp covered in pus and lesions. His breath stank of rotting meat. His legs doubled in size from swelling, then cracked open. The smell became so intolerable that even loyal courtiers stopped visiting. Servants burned sulfur to mask the air. Visitors were kept at a distance, allowed only to glimpse the form beneath the covers. But by then, he wasn't a boy, or a king. He was a ruin, a biological tragedy with a crown. And yet, England was told he was improving. They lied. They had to, because the truth was unwatchable. The sun rose blood-red over Hampton Court Palace on the 12th day of October in the year 1537, casting a glow over the River Thames that seemed almost ceremonial, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath for England's most longed-for event. Inside the royal bedchamber, Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third queen and final hope, was in the final hours of a harrowing labour that had already stretched beyond 30 hours and shown no signs of mercy. Outside, Courtiers paced in hushed urgency. Messengers galloped between gates, and physicians whispered prayers beneath their breath, knowing full well that this child was no ordinary child, and this delivery was not merely a birth, but a dynastic resurrection. Henry had wagered wives, war, and the wrath of the papacy on this moment. And when at last, amid screams and blood and the rasping breath of a fading mother, the infant was drawn into the world crying, red-faced, alive it seemed as though England itself exhaled. But the blood had only just begun. From the very first moments of his existence, Edward was surrounded not by lullabies or warmth, but by incense, iron, and fear. Jane Seymour, gaunt and shivering, smiled once upon hearing that the child was a boy, then began to bleed again. Her fever set in swiftly, an unmistakable sign to any midwife of the time childbed sickness. The cruel infection born from unclean instruments and unseen bacteria had taken hold. For 12 days she drifted between lucidity and agony, until on the 24th of October, she died not in a queen's bed, but in a field of soaked linens, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the gilded ceiling, her hand clenched around a rosary. The nation mourned, but not equally. For some, Jane's death was a tragic price for the ultimate gain. England now had a male heir, Henry VIII. Elated and devastated in equal measure, clung to his newborn son with the reverence of a man who had traded love for legacy. And so the myth-making began. Edward was proclaimed England's future, God's gift, a new Josiah, the prince destined to rebuild a broken kingdom. Poets declared that he would repair the ruins of Troy. Astrologers were summoned. His horoscope was charted, and all the while, the child lay motionless in his cradle, wrapped in linens scented with lavender, watched over by women who rotated in shifts of holy silence. Yet even then, in the soft folds of infancy, there were signs that something was wrong. He cried less than expected. His breathing, according to one chambermaid's account, was sometimes shallow, sometimes strangely rattling. But no one dared speak the thought aloud. England had waited too long for a son. To question his strength was to question the Tudor legacy itself. The silence that would ultimately smother Edward's truth began in his cradle. The precautions taken to protect him bordered on obsessive, though to the Tudor mind, they were not precautions, they were necessities. His nursery was sealed and disinfected with boiled vinegar. The windows were shuttered against bad air. Every person who came near him was ordered to wash their hands in rosewater and undergo inspection for any sign of disease. Herbal bundles hung from every beam. The floor was scrubbed daily. The walls washed weekly. No child, royal or otherwise, had ever been so carefully entombed in sterility. The food brought to the wet nurses was tasted by 3 separate stewards. Water was boiled. Even his toys were dipped in cleansing spirits. In this cocoon of antiseptic paranoia, Edward was raised not as a boy, but as a living relic of his father's will, polished, protected, and entirely unprepared for the real world. And so, as the years passed and other children scraped their knees, caught colds, survived fevers, and built the immune systems of peasants and soldiers, Edward lay beneath silken blankets, untouched by dirt and unchallenged by germs. The result, invisible at first, was devastating. Dr. Christopher Langton, writing decades later, speculated that Edward's constant isolation had crippled the natural defenses of the flesh and left him vulnerable to the smallest invader. It is now understood, through modern science, that early exposure to microbes builds resistance. But the Tudors knew only fear, and fear built Edward's childhood like a fortress with no way out. The first clear sign of fragility came in 1541. Edward, now 4 years old, contracted what court records called a quartan fever, likely a form of malaria. The boy shivered uncontrollably for days. His lips turned blue. He refused food. The entire palace ground to a halt. Henry VIII, upon hearing of the illness, exploded in fury, dismissing physicians and threatening to have them executed should his son perish. But the boy did not die. Not yet. He recovered partially, yet those closest to him noticed that something had changed. His appetite never quite returned. He grew quieter, slept more, and most importantly, he lost the endurance of childhood. He could no longer play for more than minutes at a time without turning pale. His heart would race. His skin would sweat. But nothing could be said. Not officially. The myth had to remain intact. And so, for the public, Edward was strong, bright, and healthy. Behind palace walls, he was fading. More illnesses followed. A winter rash that blistered his skin and left scarring down his legs. A bout of vomiting that left him weakened for weeks. Recurring chest colds that no draughts could fully calm. His tutors, though impressed by his intellect, quietly reported to the council that the prince tired easily and sometimes struggled to breathe during recitations. His diet became restricted, milk upset his stomach, game meat gave him cramps. He began to consume mostly broth, white bread, and boiled eggs. Still, the portraits came, all in glowing colour. Edward with ruddy cheeks, Edward with sword in hand, Edward pointing toward heaven. They painted him like a saint, while those who dressed him knew they were fitting garments onto a child whose limbs had begun to tremble under their own weight. By the time he was 8, the boy's life had already narrowed into a pattern of ceremony and silence. He would rise late, often due to poor sleep. His breakfast was a ritual in bland nutrition. His studies were interrupted by headaches. His walks were shortened by fatigue. Yet nothing could stop the machine of monarchy. As the only son of Henry VIII, he bore the full weight of the dynasty on his narrow shoulders. The more his body failed him, the more the palace compensated with pageantry. His attendants adjusted his posture. His tutors moderated his lessons. His physicians adjusted his potions. And all the while, the myth of the Golden Prince grew louder. But the myth could not outpace the truth forever. When Henry VIII died in January of 1547, Edward, barely 9, was thrust into kingship. His coronation was grand in theory, but quietly revised in practice. The processional route was shortened. The ceremonial speeches were trimmed. The boy could not stand unaided for more than minutes at a time. The weight of the crown triggered headaches so violent he needed rest before the anointing. Yet to the watching world, Edward Tudor, crowned and cloaked in gold, stood as a beacon of England's Protestant future. The boy king, the living triumph of male succession, the fulfillment of Henry's blood-drenched ambition. The lie was perfect, and yet the lie was leaking. The years to come would not be kind to Edward. He would be expected to lead, legislate, and reform, all while his body deteriorated in silence. He would be watched constantly by men who cared more for succession than survival, and he would be remembered officially as a boy king of promise and piety. But the documents buried in noble archives, the personal letters never intended for public eyes, tell another story. They speak of trembling hands, bloodied linens, shallow breathing, sunken eyes. They speak of a child raised not to live, but to fulfill a fantasy, and in doing so, marked for suffering from the very first breath. Because the truth is that Edward VI was never healthy. He was born of blood, raised in fear, crowned by denial. And from the very beginning he was born to die. From the moment the heavy Tudor crown was lowered onto the head of a 9-year-old boy who could barely keep his eyes open, England began performing a fiction so elaborate that it would fool the world for years and ultimately swallow its protagonist whole. Edward VI, newly crowned King of England, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, and supreme head of the Church of England, was not healthy. He was not strong. He was not fit to rule in body or in blood. But the empire his father had built, the religion he had split, and the political machinery that pulsed like a second heart within the walls of Whitehall, demanded a living figure to hold it all together. And so, Edward became a stage prop in velvet and gold, his thin frame lifted by servants, his trembling hands steadied by courtiers, his failing voice echoed by proclamations he could barely comprehend, much less command. His coronation in February of 1547 was as much a magic trick as it was a ritual of succession, with every moment choreographed to hide the truth that the boy meant to carry the legacy of Henry VIII could barely carry his own body. He was 9, but smaller than most boys of 6. His cheeks, once full in infancy, had hollowed. His limbs, thin as switches, were prone to swelling and aches. His appetite, long a subject of concern, continued to diminish, and though his intellect remained sharp, quick even, for his age, his ability to endure the physical strain of kingship was already vanishing before it had truly begun. The ceremony itself had to be shortened. The golden crown, lined with ermine, caused such severe headaches that it had to be removed between segments. For parts of the processional route, he was carried in a litter, unable to walk the full length required by tradition. The people cheered. The bells rang. The trumpets sounded, and artists began to sketch what they had been told to see: a golden boy king, haloed in divine legitimacy, righteous in religion, and blessed by heaven's will. But in the shadows behind the tapestries, the truth had already begun to rot. From the very first day of Edward's reign, those closest to him knew that the role he had inherited was far too vast for the frame he inhabited. His uncle, Edward Seymour, now elevated to Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector of the realm, quickly became the true ruler of England, while the boy king, thin and glass-eyed, presided over councils he could barely remain conscious for. Seymour, an ambitious and calculating man, understood that his own power hinged entirely on the illusion of the king's health and strength. And so, the architecture of the greatest deception in Tudor history was erected brick by brick, edict by edict, image by image. Royal physicians were ordered to speak only in generalities. Painful symptoms were downplayed, misnamed, or omitted altogether. The king's more severe episodes, fevers, vomiting, coughing blood, were hidden behind locked doors and muffled bedding, and the artists were called in. Portraiture in Tudor England was not merely artistic expression. It was propaganda carved in oil and gilt, a tool of myth-making more powerful than the king's army. And so the painters went to work. Hans Holbein was long gone, but his legacy of idealized realism had left its mark, and every commissioned image of Edward now followed a formula: shoulders square, eyes focused, garments rich, sword visible, scepter upright, and most importantly, no indication of frailty. The image of Edward as a miniature Henry Radiant, steady, immortal, was repeated so often that it became indistinguishable from fact, even to those who knew better. But beneath the silk and pigment, the real boy was beginning to disappear. The records, those few that escaped the careful hands of royal censorship, tell a quieter, darker story. By the age of 10, Edward's body had already begun its steady decline. His immune system, never robust, seemed incapable of resisting even the mildest seasonal illness. A passing cough would linger for weeks. A minor rash would become infected. The physicians, Thomas Wendy chief among them, prescribed the usual courses: leeching, bleeding, tonics made from antimony and crushed pearls, and of course, mercury-based compounds meant to balance the humours, but which likely accelerated his deterioration. Despite the mounting evidence of his fragility, Public proclamations continued to insist upon his bright constitution and vigorous appetite, while behind the walls of his private chambers, servants changed his bedding 3 times daily to manage the night sweats. The oozing sores, the blood-spotted linens, and the increasingly alarming smell that clung to his skin like a death shroud. But England was not built for the truth. England needed a king. So when Edward appeared in public, which grew rarer with each passing year, extraordinary measures were taken. His robes were padded to add bulk to his frame. His cheeks were rouged with powder to simulate health. His posture was propped by hidden supports beneath his clothing. And when he gave speeches, his voice thin, breathless. Cracking his words were often rehearsed by others, echoed by heralds, or rewritten entirely for publication. He had become a ghost in flesh, a marionette moved by the ambitions of men far stronger than he. And as he aged into adolescence, the mask only grew heavier. By the time he was 12, the effects of his condition could no longer be completely concealed. The chronic cough that had once been dismissed as seasonal had grown deeper, more frequent, more productive. His tutors noted the flecks of blood on his handkerchiefs. His physicians began to describe his sputum as clotted and dark, clear signs of consumption, what we now recognize as tuberculosis. Yet the court continued to operate as if nothing were amiss. Courtiers who dared to speak of the king's health in too candid a tone found themselves reassigned, reprimanded, or removed. Diplomats were presented with carefully managed encounters. Foreign observers, though often skeptical, had no access to the boy beyond the pageantry. And so the illusion persisted. But even illusions have weight. The longer the deception continued, the more strain it placed on Edward himself. He was, for all his isolation, not stupid. In fact, he was remarkably perceptive. His journal entries, preserved in fragments, reveal a young man who understood the gravity of his role and the fragility of his person. He wrote of feeling tired, of praying for strength, of fearing that his weakness would shame the cause of Protestant reform. He devoured scripture, not merely as doctrine, but as reassurance. He began to fashion himself as a kind of Protestant martyr, a boy king whose suffering could be transmuted into holiness. It was not hope. It was rationalization, a way to make sense of the endless decline. The pressure to perform increased with each month. His legs swelled unpredictably, sometimes so severely that his trousers had to be slit and restitched daily. His joints ached. His appetite faded further. There were days he could not rise from bed. And yet the official proclamations continued, praising his courage, his decisions, his youthful vigor, even as his voice cracked into silence, even as his fingers trembled too much to hold a pen. England was told that its king was thriving. This was the mask. It was made of paint and poetry and fear. It was built by politicians and guarded by servants who said nothing. It was carried by a boy who knew it was a lie, who wore it anyway, because the alternative was to let the world see what Henry VIII had truly left behind, a child made of dust and divine expectation, collapsing beneath the very legacy he was born to uphold. When Edward VI was carried to Westminster Abbey for his coronation, the heavy Tudor crown pressed down upon his thin temples like an iron prophecy. For even then it was not a symbol of strength, but a burden too vast for his shrunken body to bear. The pages of official chronicles declared him radiant, composed, and regal. Yet those who were close enough to see the tremor in his lips or the pallor in his skin understood that this coronation was not the anointing of a robust monarch, but the dressing of a frail boy in garments that weighed almost as much as he did. The throne into which he was lowered, built to uphold dynasties and empires, was already breaking him, and over the years that followed, as he was made to sit through councils, sign proclamations, and play the role of God's chosen king, the throne became both his seat of majesty and his prison of bone, crushing him slowly under its demand that he appear whole, when in truth he was unraveling. The weight of kingship is heavy for any ruler, but for a boy of 9, who could not stand unassisted through a single ceremony, it was more than metaphor. It was a physical torment. The crown itself, rimmed with pearls and lined with ermine, gave him such violent headaches that he was forced to lie in bed for days after the coronation, clutching his temples as the doctors bled him in the hope that pain would flow out with the blood. The robes, layered in velvet and gold thread, were not simply symbols of majesty, but barriers that trapped his heat and exacerbated his fevers. So that beneath the gleaming surface of portraiture, he sweated and shivered, a fragile body drowning in fabric, meant for giants. Even the scepter, painted as firm in his grip, often had to be steadied by hidden supports or adjusted by attendants just beyond the canvas frame, for his fingers trembled too much to hold it upright for long. Every object of sovereignty that was meant to announce his strength, in fact, reminded him of his weakness. And in this irony lay the cruel truth. The throne was never designed for a child who could not carry its weight. The early years of his reign unfolded under the watchful hand of his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, whose title as Lord Protector gave him the real authority, while Edward's body served as a living emblem. Yet even the Protector could not ignore the reality of the king's fragility, and so elaborate strategies were devised to sustain the illusion. Courtiers were instructed to stand close to the boy during ceremonies, ready to catch him if he swayed. The procession routes were shortened, and chairs were hidden in the wings so that he could be carried discreetly when his legs refused to bear him. Artists were told to render him in poses of vigor, with a sword at his side and eyes fixed on eternity, while the boy himself often lay coughing into bloodied cloths between sittings. Painters did not record the trembling of his hands or the shadows beneath his eyes. They recorded what England demanded: a healthy king. Thus, each portrait became another layer of the mask, a second body painted over the decaying one, a promise of strength that would never come true. The strain of this performance only accelerated his decline. For every hour he spent sitting in council chambers or paraded in public, he paid days in bed, racked by fever and coughing so hard his ribs ached. The throne demanded that he sign documents, yet his fingers were so swollen from edema that holding a quill became an act of agony, the letters devolving from sharp script into shaky scratches that betrayed more than his advisors wanted known. The throne demanded that he appear as the head of Christ's Reformed Church. Yet his voice, once bright in boyhood, now emerged as a whisper, shredded by disease, forcing heralds and scribes to amplify words he could barely pronounce. The throne demanded that he embody divine authority. Yet his body betrayed him daily, leaving him gasping, bleeding, sweating, and shrinking beneath the gaze of a kingdom desperate to believe in his vitality. At 12, his growth had stalled completely. While his peers in noble households rode horses, hunted deer, and grew into the broad shoulders of adolescence, Edward remained a frail figure, his limbs stick-thin, his chest sunken, and his belly oddly distended. Observers noted his ghostly pallor and the bluish tinge around his lips, classic signs of failing circulation. Night sweats soaked his bedding so thoroughly that the linens had to be burned rather than washed. His tutors reported that he fell asleep during lessons, unable to sustain concentration for more than minutes, though his mind, when alert, remained sharp and fiercely devoted to theology. He turned increasingly to scripture, perhaps as a way of rationalizing the torment of his body, telling himself that his suffering was a trial ordained by God, a purgation that aligned him with the martyrs of old. This religious intensity worried even his Protestant advisors, for it seemed less like faith and more like desperation, a boy attempting to transform his collapse into meaning. Meanwhile, the throne demanded more. The protectorate collapsed into factional disputes, and with each new power struggle, Edward was trotted out as the symbol of continuity. His presence used to legitimize decisions made by men far stronger and far more ruthless than he. He was carried into chambers, propped on cushions, displayed as though he were participating when in reality he was enduring. His very body became a battlefield where political ambition and biological failure clashed. And the throne was the stage upon which this cruel performance unfolded. As his spine began to curve from the wasting effects of disease, tailors crafted new garments to conceal the deformity. As his voice weakened further, proclamations were read in his name rather than by his lips. As his cough grew harsher, ambassadors were told that it was merely a passing chill. The boy disappeared piece by piece, until only the throne remained visible. By 15, the deterioration could no longer be fully masked. His legs had swollen grotesquely, his face bloated and distorted, his eyes sunken behind dark circles. He could no longer walk without help. The cough rattled constantly, producing clots of blood that stained his sheets. His breath came in shallow gasps. And yet still, the throne demanded its ritual. And still he was forced to appear when absolutely necessary, carried before ambassadors. His frail form hidden under layers of fabric, his voice replaced by silence, interpreted as authority. It was not kingship. It was exploitation. He was, by then, a vessel emptied of strength, filled only with pain, yet placed upon the throne as if it alone could transform him into something divine. But thrones do not heal. Thrones do not forgive. Thrones only consume. For Edward, each day spent sustaining the illusion hastened the breakdown of his body. Each appearance drained him further. Each demand left new scars. By the time the court admitted that he was seriously ill, it was already far too late. The throne that had promised to elevate him had instead broken him, grinding his fragile frame into pieces until nothing remained but a boy who had once been England's hope and was now its greatest horror, a king who rotted while he reigned. The story of Edward VI cannot be told without naming the shadow that stalked him from childhood and finally consumed him in his 15th year. The ancient disease that Tudor physicians did not fully recognize and could not hope to cure. A disease that turned lungs into honeycombs of pus, left skin clammy with night sweats, and wasted bodies into husks. And that disease was tuberculosis. In Edward's day, they called it consumption, a name drawn from the way it seemed to devour a person from the inside out, leaving them hollow-eyed, coughing blood, and slowly extinguished like a candle burning too low. For centuries it haunted Europe, striking down paupers in hovels and kings in palaces alike. But in Tudor England, its presence was disguised beneath the veil of ignorance. And in the case of Edward, its progression was hidden behind layers of political necessity, until the body of the boy king betrayed the truth so violently that no proclamation could smother it. It began as a cough, the kind any child might develop in damp English winters. But Edward's cough lingered when others subsided, rattling in his chest and accompanied by fevers that drenched his linens in sweat. Physicians bled him in the hope of releasing corrupt humours, applied blistering poultices that raised painful boils, and prescribed potions of mercury and arsenic that poisoned his already fragile organs. Each treatment weakened him further, and yet the cough continued, sometimes dry and hacking, sometimes wet with flecks of crimson that stained his handkerchiefs. His tutors noticed the fatigue, the way he leaned heavily on his desk, his breathing laboured after even short walks, his concentration broken by sudden fits of coughing that left him gasping for breath. But to the court, the official story was one of recovery, of youthful resilience, of a king destined to grow into strength. And so the truth was hidden, even as tuberculosis took deeper hold of his body. By the year 1550, Edward's condition had worsened noticeably. Though public records described only a mild fever or temporary weakness, privately, however, reports circulated among foreign ambassadors that the king appeared ghostly, his cheeks hollow, his frame alarmingly thin, his skin so translucent that blue veins traced across his temples. The imperial ambassador, writing in code to avoid censure, described him as a living corpse and predicted that he could not last the year. The truth was that tuberculosis was already far advanced, spreading from his lungs into his bloodstream, creating pockets of infection that seeded themselves in bones, joints, and organs. Modern medicine calls this miliary tuberculosis, a form so devastating that it riddles the body with tiny lesions, producing fever, wasting, and systemic collapse. Edward was, unknowingly, its victim, and each day of courtly deception only deepened his suffering. The symptoms multiplied, his joints swelled painfully, sometimes so much that he could not hold a quill or lift a goblet without grimacing. His legs puffed grotesquely, fluid seeping through stretched skin that cracked open and leaked onto the floor, a clear sign that his kidneys and lymphatic system were failing under the strain of infection. His appetite dwindled to nothing, leaving him subsisting on weak broths and watered wine, his once boyish face now gaunt, his teeth loosening in their sockets from malnutrition and chronic infection. Nights became unbearable, his sheets soaked through with sweat, his body shaking with chills, even as he burned with fever. Servants burned herbs and perfumes constantly in an attempt to mask the odor that seeped from his room, the sickly sweet smell of infection and decay that clung to his body and made even hardened attendants blanch. What made Edward's ordeal particularly cruel was that Tudor medicine, guided by the theory of the four humours, believed that aggressive intervention could restore balance, and so his physicians subjected him to treatments that in retrospect only hastened his decline. He was bled repeatedly, weakening his already anemic body. He was given emetics that made him vomit violently, further dehydrating him and tearing at his throat, already raw from constant coughing. Blistering agents were applied to his chest to draw out corruption, leaving burns that became infected. Mercury was administered to purge disease, poisoning his kidneys further. Antimony, arsenic, and other toxic compounds were introduced in hope of stimulating recovery. But instead, they joined forces with tuberculosis to overwhelm his organs. By attempting to cure him, the physicians inadvertently accelerated his journey toward death, though none dared admit it. For to confess, failure was to court royal wrath and political ruin. The courtiers who surrounded Edward were not blind to his suffering, yet they acted as if his body were not his own, but the property of the state. Reports of his failing health were censored. Ambassadors were denied access or shown orchestrated glimpses of the king propped up on cushions, his voice little more than a whisper, but presented as deliberate majesty, behind closed doors. However, the truth was unbearable. Servants recorded that his cough sometimes produced not only blood, but chunks of necrotic tissue, pieces of lung literally dissolving and expelled through his mouth. His ribs protruded starkly through his skin, while his abdomen swelled grotesquely with retained fluid, a cruel contrast that made his figure appear simultaneously skeletal and bloated. His back began to curve, his spine eaten away by tubercular lesions that caused constant pain. No amount of opium syrup could fully dull it. His once bright eyes dulled to glassy hollows, sometimes staring vacantly for hours, as if already gazing into another world. By the winter of 1552 into 1553, the disease had reached its terminal stage. Tuberculosis had spread beyond his lungs and bones into his bloodstream, causing systemic failure. His kidneys produced foul-smelling, dark urine, sometimes streaked with blood. His liver swelled and hardened, visible beneath his thin skin. His heart, once a symbol of divine strength, became enlarged and riddled with lesions. He could no longer rise from bed. His breathing was shallow, punctuated by the ominous rattle of fluid in his chest. Ambassadors who saw him in these months described him as unrecognizable, his once fair hair gone, his face swollen, his lips cracked and bluish. And yet proclamations still declared that the king was improving, that prayers had been answered, That hope remained. It was a lie too great to abandon. For the truth would have shattered. The fragile political order balanced on his failing chest. Tuberculosis not only destroyed Edward's body, but reshaped the kingdom's future. As he declined, power brokers gathered around his bed like vultures, pressing documents into his swollen hands, forcing his fading signature onto the infamous device for succession that attempted to bypass his Catholic sister Mary and place Lady Jane Grey on the throne. He was so weak that his signature degenerated from steady script to an illegible scrawl, evidence of a hand swollen with edema and trembling with exhaustion. Yet still they insisted, because as long as he breathed, his authority could be weaponized. In this way, tuberculosis was not only a medical tragedy, but a political one, for the disease stripped him of agency, leaving him a pawn in a game of succession. A dying boy used as a tool while his body collapsed, cell by cell. The final months were a parade of horrors. His skin erupted in sores that oozed constantly, staining his linens. His teeth loosened until he could no longer chew, forcing him to subsist on liquids. His voice became unintelligible, a hoarse rasp broken by coughing, fits that left him spitting blood and gasping for breath. His fingernails darkened and fell away. His hair, once the reddish hue of his father's, fell out in clumps, leaving his scalp raw and scabbed. He bled spontaneously from his gums, his nose, even his eyes. Signs of the systemic breakdown that tuberculosis in its advanced stage can trigger. Servants described the smell in his chamber as unbearable, a mixture of rotting flesh and sour decay, so strong that guards outside rotated hourly to avoid vomiting. And still, Tudor propaganda insisted upon dignity, piety, and strength, transforming his biological collapse into a narrative of divine testing and holy suffering, when in truth it was nothing more than the brutal reality of untreated tuberculosis tearing apart a child's body. Modern medicine, looking back, can diagnose his condition with cruel clarity. Antibiotics would have cured him. Nutritional support would have strengthened him. Kidney dialysis could have prolonged his life. Palliative care would have eased his pain. But in Tudor England, none of these existed. What Edward endured was the full force of tuberculosis unmitigated by knowledge or compassion, and it reduced him to little more than a skeleton covered in sores by the time death came in July of 1553. His reign, 6 years and a half in length, had been spent not in glory, but in gradual decomposition. On his throne, an executioner in gold, did his crown, a crown of thorns disguised in jewels. Tuberculosis was the unseen killer, but the court was complicit, for in their denial, their manipulation, and their desperate preservation of the Tudor myth, they allowed the boy to waste away in agony rather than acknowledge the truth. In the end, Edward's body became both victim and metaphor, consumed by the same rot that spread through the Tudor court itself. His organs, liquefied and diseased, mirrored the corruption of the men who used his final breaths for political ambition. His cough, echoing through the chambers of Greenwich Palace, was the sound of a dynasty suffocating beneath the weight of its own lies. And when his body was finally opened for embalming, what they found inside was not just medical evidence of tuberculosis, but the physical manifestation of a kingdom that had refused to face reality until it was too late. By the spring of 1553, Edward VI was no longer simply dying, he was decomposing in real time. A child king whose body had begun the process of decay before his soul had even left it. To those who attended him in his final months, it was as if nature itself had grown impatient with the usual order of things, erasing the boundaries between life and death, and forcing them to witness what should never be seen, the collapse of a living body into something cadaverous, while consciousness still flickered within. The smell that drifted through the corridors of Greenwich Palace was not the faint musk of sickness, but the unmistakable stench of rot. a warning that the flesh was surrendering long before the last breath. And even the most hardened servants confessed that tending to the king had become an ordeal of endurance rather than duty. The first visible signs of decomposition came with his skin, once pale but smooth. It now erupted with ulcers that spread across his scalp, face, and limbs, oozing fluids that soaked his linens and required constant replacement. His hair, already falling out in clumps, left behind patches of raw, scabbed skin that darkened in color and gave off a sickly odor. His fingernails blackened, loosened, and finally detached, leaving exposed nail beds that became inflamed and painful. His lips cracked and split, darkened with dried blood, while sores inside his mouth made eating nearly impossible. Servants attempted to feed him broths through straws, but even swallowing became an agony. As lesions spread down his throat, he wasted away, yet his abdomen grotesquely distended, stretched tight with accumulated fluid. A cruel parody of health that made his frame appear both skeletal and bloated at once. The paradox horrified those who saw it, for he resembled neither a boy nor a man, but some unnatural hybrid of life and death. His legs, swollen far beyond their natural size, split open from the pressure, leaking clear fluid that soaked through bandages within hours. His ankles disappeared into the swelling, and his toes puffed so grotesquely that his rings had to be cut off his fingers when the swelling spread upward. The sores on his back from lying in bed too long grew deeper until they exposed raw flesh, and the smell of infected tissue joined the stench of his diseased lungs to create an atmosphere so intolerable that herbs, perfumes, and even burning sulfur failed to disguise it. Guards outside the chamber rotated frequently because many became ill simply standing near the door. And even courtiers loyal to the regime avoided entering unless absolutely necessary. Only a handful of attendants remained constant, cleaning his wounds, changing his linens, and holding water to his cracked lips. Their silence, the only testament to a suffering too terrible to describe openly, the cough that had plagued him for years, reached its most violent stage, tearing through his chest with a sound that witnesses later compared to the gurgling of water in a broken pipe. He no longer produced only blood, but also thick, foul-smelling clots of pus and fragments of decayed tissue, evidence that his lungs were collapsing into necrosis. Sometimes the abscesses in his chest burst, flooding his throat with fluid and nearly choking him as he coughed it out in a frenzy of panic. The rattle of his breathing, audible even outside the room, was described in letters as the sound of death rehearsed in every breath. At night, when silence fell across the palace, this ghastly sound carried through the corridors, and those who heard it swore they would never forget it. His chest barely rose with the effort of breathing, and yet the sound of liquid within made clear that he was drowning slowly in his own body. Delirium came and went in waves. Some days he stared at the ceiling for hours without speaking, his eyes glassy, unresponsive to those around him. Other days he muttered prayers or cried out for his father, Henry VIII, or for his mother, Jane Seymour, whom he had never known but whose image lingered in his mind as the sainted woman who had died to bring him into the world. On his worst nights, attendants reported that he begged God to end his suffering, whispering hoarsely that he could not bear another morning. Religious interpretations swirled among those who watched. Protestants said his agony was a holy trial. Catholics whispered it was divine punishment for his persecution of the old faith. But those who were in the room, who saw the blood on his lips and the fluids on his sheets, abandoned theology altogether, for what they witnessed seemed too senseless, too cruel, too meaningless to attribute to any divine plan. It was biology in its most merciless form, dismantling a boy piece by piece, even as his body collapsed. The machinery of politics ground on. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, desperate to secure his grip on power, pressed the dying king to sign the device for succession. bypassing Mary and Elizabeth in favour of Lady Jane Grey. His daughter-in-law, Edward's hands, swollen and trembling, could barely grip a pen, and his once legible signature degenerated into a jagged scrawl that bore witness to his physical ruin. The boy who should have been spared all such burdens was forced to perform the last act of kingship, not with strength, but with a shaking hand guided by those who exploited his weakness. In this way, his body became not only the site of disease, but the theatre of manipulation, a stage upon which courtiers gambled while the protagonist withered away. By June, Edward was so wasted that his bones were visible beneath his stretched, translucent skin, his eyes sunken into hollows that made him appear more corpse than living child. Yet his abdomen remained grotesquely distended, his flesh taut with retained fluid. Servants reported that his body emitted noises, gurgling, wheezing, and even the faint crackle of shifting gas within, as if decomposition had begun while he still breathed. His urine, when he could produce any, was nearly black with blood, and his bowels failed him, leaving foul stains that could not be washed away from sheets already saturated with sweat and pus. The chamber itself became uninhabitable, the air thick with the smell of death, forcing attendants to burn aromatic woods and sprinkle the floors with vinegar in vain, attempts to stave off the nauseating stench. It was said that the floorboards beneath his bed became so saturated with fluids that they had to be replaced after his death. A mundane detail preserved in household accounts that tells more truth than any official proclamation. The last weeks were a study in torment. His face became puffy and unrecognizable, his eyes reduced to slits by swelling. His lips cracked open so deeply that he bled, even when silent. His voice was gone, destroyed by constant coughing and ruptured tissue, so that he could no longer speak above a rasp. Ambassadors who demanded proof of his survival were admitted to the chamber, but kept at a distance, shown only the vague form of a body beneath heavy covers, and told to listen to faint groans interpreted as commands. They left with the certainty that the king was dying, but still they reported cautiously, knowing that truth was dangerous in a court where reality was considered treason. Modern medicine makes clear what Tudor physicians could not admit: Edward was experiencing complete systemic failure. The organs of his body shutting down one by one under the relentless spread of tuberculosis and the added damage inflicted by misguided treatments. His lungs were gone, replaced by cavities of pus and blood. His kidneys were failing, producing little urine. His liver was scarred and discolored. His heart was swollen and weakened, unable to circulate blood effectively. His skin had broken under the strain, turning him into an open wound. He was, in medical terms, already in the process of decomposition. Even as consciousness clung to him in cruel intervals, the throne by then was irrelevant. Edward was no longer a king, but a body unraveling in public secrecy, tended by servants who could not speak of what they saw, manipulated by courtiers who used his dying hand to shape succession, and hidden from a nation that still believed in the fiction of his strength. The irony was brutal. Henry VIII had sacrificed wives, faith, and bloodlines for a male heir, only for that heir to dissolve before reaching manhood, his body serving as a grotesque mirror of the dynasty's own fragility. By early July, Edward's face bore the unmistakable signs of approaching death. His skin darkened in patches, bruises appearing across his body where blood vessels burst. He bled from nose, gums, and eyes. Guards outside the room heard the wet gurgle of his final breaths, the death rattle that lasted day and night, the sound so terrible that some prayed for the moment of silence that would finally end it. And still the court maintained appearances, insisting that prayers were helping, that the king's spirit remained strong, that England's future was secure. But no amount of rhetoric could disguise what had become undeniable. The boy king was decomposing before their eyes, and there was no dignity left to salvage. By the summer of 1553, Edward VI was no longer master of his body, and even less master of his throne. The tuberculosis that had ravaged him for years had reduced him to a husk barely able to lift his head. And yet, the kingdom still required of him an authority that he could no longer exercise. In these final weeks, the boy king became less a sovereign than a prop in the most desperate political drama of Tudor England. A living signature attached to the ambitions of men who gathered around his bed like crows. He was manipulated, coerced, and paraded as if his gasps for breath were proclamations of divine right. And the tragedy of his reign reached its climax in the moment when his swollen hand, trembling and nearly useless, was forced to scrawl his name on a document that would outlive him, the device for succession. An edict that bypassed his sisters Mary and Elizabeth in favour of Lady Jane Grey, a pliant figurehead who was, conveniently, married into the family of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Edward had always been deeply invested in Protestant reform, encouraged since childhood to see himself as a new Josiah, the biblical boy king who restored true religion to Israel. This religious fervour, combined with his natural desire to preserve the Reformation he had championed, made him a convenient instrument for Northumberland, who presented the succession device not as a power grab, but as a divine necessity to prevent Catholic Mary from undoing Edward's reforms. The boy, half delirious with fever and racked by coughing fits, was persuaded that signing the document was not only his duty, but his last offering to God. Yet the reality of his condition made even this act of compliance a grotesque ordeal. His hands, swollen with fluid retention, could barely hold a quill. His fingers trembled uncontrollably. His eyes, blurred by exhaustion and illness, struggled to focus on the parchment, and so Northumberland and his allies guided him, sometimes physically, pressing his hand to the page, steadying his strokes, ensuring that the required mark appeared. The first draft of his signature was shaky, but still recognizable Edward. The second, weaker, faltered midway. The final versions descended into near illegibility, little more than a wavering line that testified to the agony behind each movement. The boy who had once written eloquently in Latin and Greek now could not even spell his own name in a straight line. Each mark on the page was a scar left by disease, each scrawl evidence of a child's body collapsing, even as the machinery of politics demanded more. The signature, preserved in the document itself, became the most tragic artifact of his reign, not a bold declaration of authority, but the scribbled trace of a dying hand, used by others to justify their own ambitions. In truth, Edward had little understanding of the full consequences of what he signed. He believed, perhaps sincerely, that he was preserving Protestantism. He may even have thought he was saving his soul. But those who stood around his bed knew what it meant in practice. It meant civil unrest. It meant succession crisis. It meant blood. For Northumberland, it meant the chance to control the throne through Lady Jane Grey. For Edward's counsellors, it meant one last opportunity to shape the future before the inevitable death. And for Edward himself, it meant nothing but pain. For the effort of signing left him exhausted, trembling, gasping, sometimes too weak, even to wipe the blood from his lips after a violent coughing fit. What makes these final days unbearable to contemplate is not only the physical torment of the king, but the manner in which his humanity was erased. He was no longer treated as a boy who had suffered too much, not even as a monarch whose life was slipping away. He was treated as a necessary signature, a body required to perform one last legal function before it expired. Witnesses were brought to his bedside, not to comfort him, but to confirm his presence, to attest that the king, though visibly dying, had spoken, or at least moved enough to validate the documents laid before him. He was displayed like a puppet whose strings were yanked by men standing just beyond the canopy of his bed, and his faint groans or unintelligible whispers were interpreted as commands. The boy who had once been celebrated as the hope of England was reduced to a hollow vessel for other men's ambitions. Meanwhile, his body continued to betray him in the most horrifying ways. His skin, stretched by swelling, cracked and oozed, his lips turned bluish, his breath shallow and gurgling with the ever-present rattle of liquid in his lungs. His eyes, sunken and rimmed with dark circles, darted with confusion or stared into emptiness. He had to be propped up with cushions when witnesses entered, for lying flat made it impossible for him to breathe. The room reeked of decomposition. Yet political necessity overrode disgust, and the king's chamber became both a deathbed and a council chamber, a place where the final moments of a child's life were exploited for signatures that might never have been his own. The irony is that even in these final days, Edward still clung to faith. His journal entries, scrawled in weaker handwriting than before, reveal a boy attempting to reconcile his physical collapse with divine purpose. He wrote that his body faileth daily, but that his spirit must remain strong for England and for God's true religion. These words, though sincere, were seized upon by Northumberland and his faction as justification for pushing him further, demanding that he complete the device and endorse it publicly. In his attempt to find meaning in suffering, Edward was manipulated into giving political cover to decisions that would plunge the realm into chaos the moment his last breath came. By late June, Edward could barely raise his head, and yet his chamber was still crowded with counsellors, physicians, scribes, and witnesses. Some came reluctantly, disturbed by the spectacle. Others came eagerly, determined to secure their positions in the new order. But all of them came to take something from the boy king, who by then had nothing left to give. The final witnesses reported that he sometimes sobbed in frustration, his mouth opening as if to speak, but producing only a hoarse rasp. His swollen tongue made speech impossible, his throat destroyed by endless coughing. The courtiers, unwilling to waste time, recorded his noises as words, interpreting them as assent, converting his suffering into signatures, and transforming his final days into a charade of consent. The truth, preserved only in fragments, is that Edward VI died not only of tuberculosis, but of political exploitation. His body was ruined by disease, but his dignity was stripped by the men who used him to validate their ambitions. He was forced to sign away the succession, while pus filled his lungs, while sores erupted across his skin, while his mind drifted in and out of feverish delirium. He was turned into a puppet, his hand manipulated onto parchment, his name twisted into a tool that would outlive him by only 9 days. For Lady Jane Grey's reign would collapse almost as soon as it began. The boy's suffering, prolonged for weeks, purchased nothing but instability. In this way, Edward's end was not only tragic but symbolic. His body, decomposing before death, became a metaphor for a dynasty itself rotting from within, held together by lies, coercion, and fear. His signature, barely legible, mirrored the fragility of the succession. It was meant to secure his final gasps, interpreted as commands, reflected a court more concerned with politics than compassion. And when he finally succumbed on the 6th of July, his death brought not peace but turmoil. For the succession crisis he had been forced to authorize erupted immediately, casting England into 9 days of uncertainty that ended with Mary's triumph and Northumberland's execution. The boy king had been consumed by disease, and in his last days, he was consumed also by politics, leaving behind not the legacy of a reforming monarch, but the haunting memory of a child, manipulated to the very end. He had not reigned, he had been used. He had not signed, he had been compelled. He had not lived, he had been endured. And the throne upon which he had once been placed as the embodiment of Tudor triumph had in fact been his executioner, demanding more than his body could ever give. When Edward VI finally breathed his last on the 6th of July 1553, The silence that followed in his chamber was not relief, but dread. For months his death had been anticipated, whispered about in coded letters and muffled prayers. And yet when it came, the reality of his body posed a problem no proclamation could resolve. He had not simply died. He had deteriorated into a state so grotesque that his corpse was unfit for public mourning. The boy who had once been hailed as England's golden heir, the culmination of Henry VIII's obsessive quest for a son, had been reduced to something closer to carrion than royalty. And when his body was opened for embalming, the truth was laid bare. The king's remains were a horror too great to display, a spectacle that had to be hidden from the world by lead, secrecy, and denial. The embalming process in Tudor England was crude by modern standards, but routine enough for experienced practitioners. Organs were removed, cavities packed with spices and resins, the skin stitched and coated with preservatives. But Edward's body offered no routine. When his chest was opened, the physicians recoiled at the sight of lungs that had all but liquefied. Spongy tissue collapsed into pus-filled cavities, and abscesses that spilled foul-smelling fluid as soon as the scalpel touched them. His liver, normally firm and red, was mottled green and yellow, crumbling at the slightest pressure, like rotten fruit. His kidneys were discolored and scarred, evidence of chronic failure. His heart, swollen to nearly double its natural size, was covered in fibrous lesions that spoke of years of relentless infection. What lay inside the boy was not a set of organs, but the wreckage of a body destroyed from within. A catalogue of horrors that confirmed everything whispered during his illness, but denied in public. The embalmers tried desperately to salvage what they could. They used vast quantities of aromatic herbs, frankincense, myrrh, camphor, cloves, so much that household accounts later revealed expenditures far beyond the usual for a royal embalming. They stuffed cavities with resins, stitched the skin tightly, and wrapped the body in layers of cloth. Yet decomposition had already advanced so far that their efforts were futile. Within hours, the corpse began to swell, gases building up inside, until attendants reported hearing unsettling noises, gurgles and cracks that echoed from the coffin itself. Dark fluid seeped from sutures. The odor of putrefaction overwhelmed the perfumes. Those tasked with the work realized that no amount of spice or resin could disguise the truth. The king was rotting faster than he could be preserved. The decision was made to contain the problem rather than display it. Edward's coffin was sealed not once but in multiple layers. First wood, then lead, then another layer of wood, and finally encased again in lead. This was not ceremony, it was containment. The aim was not reverence but suppression. To trap the gases and fluids inside before the corpse literally burst. Even with these precautions, guards stationed near the coffin reported hearing disturbing sounds from within. The creak and shift of a body continuing its transformation into decay. Some whispered of black liquid seeping through the stone floor of the vault. Stories quickly hushed, but too persistent to dismiss entirely. Whether these accounts were exaggerations or not, they reflected a simple reality. The monarchy was desperate to keep Edward's true condition hidden, to ensure that no one outside the chamber ever knew just how far their golden prince had fallen. Officially, the decision to forego a lying in state was explained as a matter of Protestant simplicity, a rejection of the Catholic custom of displaying the body. In reality, it was a cover-up. The body was in no condition to be seen. Instead, an empty coffin was draped in cloth of gold and presented to the public, surrounded by heraldic banners and pageantry. Crowds gathered to mourn before a void, never realizing that the real coffin lay sealed away, its contents so corrupted that even loyal courtiers dared not approach. The boy who had been England's hope was hidden, even in death, replaced by an image, a symbol, a performance carefully staged to maintain dignity where none remained. The funeral on the 8th of August was grand in spectacle, but swift in execution. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer preached a sermon comparing Edward to Josiah, the biblical boy king, who reformed his kingdom, and the congregation was invited to see in Edward's brief reign the triumph of Protestant reform. Yet beneath the words, the reality was bitterly ironic. Uzziah had died young, and his reforms were swiftly overturned. Edward too had died before manhood, and his Protestant achievements were already imperiled by the impending accession of his Catholic sister Mary. The comparison was apt, though perhaps not in the way Cranmer intended. The coffin, borne by 8 guards who struggled under its unnatural weight, was lowered quickly into the vault at Westminster Abbey, sealed with unusual haste, and covered in layers of stone and mortar. Workmen were summoned that very night to secure it further, ensuring that no curious hands or inquisitive eyes would ever disturb what lay within. What they buried was not only a boy king, but the evidence of a dynasty's failure. For all of Henry VIII's sacrifices, wives executed, church destroyed, alliances broken, the son he had longed for had wasted away before his eyes, and left behind only a corpse too foul to show. The autopsy, such as it was, revealed not just tuberculosis, but systemic collapse, lungs dissolved, heart enlarged, kidneys scarred, skin ulcerated, bones weakened. The boy had been dying for years, and the regime had denied it at every stage, insisting upon health while hiding reality. Now, in death, the same denial persisted. The autopsy was buried as surely as the body, suppressed in official records, mentioned only obliquely in letters, and remembered in fragments of rumour. What the monarchy buried that summer was not just Edward VI, but the truth. Yet fragments of that truth leaked through. Household accounts included charges for floorboards replaced because of corrosive fluids that had seeped through. Servants whispered of sheets so stained they could not be cleaned but were burned in secret. Physicians recorded in private notes the horrific state of his organs, accounts that surfaced decades later in archives and shocked historians with their blunt detail. These glimpses confirmed what the regime sought to hide, that Edward's death had not been noble or peaceful, but monstrous, that his body had become an object of horror, and that the dynasty built on his birth had collapsed into decay with him. The refusal to exhume Edward's body in later centuries is telling. Requests to open the tomb for medical or historical study have been consistently denied by both the Church of England and the monarchy. Official reasons include religious respect and diplomatic sensitivity. But beneath these explanations lies another possibility: fear. Fear of what might be found if the coffin were opened. Fear of confirmation that the stories were true, that the boy king rotted so severely his body could not be displayed. Fear that the myth of the Tudors, so carefully cultivated, would be stained by the undeniable evidence of their fragility. For Edward's body was not only a corpse, it was a metaphor, a mirror held up to the dynasty itself. Just as his organs failed, so too did the structures of Tudor rule. Just as his lungs collapsed, so too did the illusions of stability. Just as his flesh rotted, so too did the legacy his father had fought to preserve. The autopsy that the monarchy buried was more than medical. It was political. It revealed the hollowness of power, the futility of sacrifice, the irony of a king who died not in battle or betrayal but in bed, consumed by disease and concealed by lies. Edward VI's body, locked away in its triple coffin, was both evidence and indictment. A silent testimony to the cost of ambition and the cruelty of fate. The monarchy buried it deep, sealed it in lead, and built monuments of denial above it. But history, like decay, has a way of seeping through the cracks, and the truth, though hidden, lingers in the air like the smell that once filled the corridors of Greenwich Palace. Edward VI's death was not merely the end of a boy king. It was the collapse of an illusion, the unravelling of a dynasty's promise, and the physical manifestation of Tudor England's deepest contradictions. For years, his body had been paraded as proof of divine favour, the culmination of Henry VIII's sacrifices and obsessions. the child for whom wives had died. Churches had been torn down, and kingdoms had been reshaped. And yet, when the coffin was sealed and the odours of decomposition contained in layers of lead, what the dynasty was left with was not triumph but denial. Edward's body, wasted, rotting, and hidden, became the most potent metaphor of Tudor power, outwardly adorned, inwardly diseased, magnificent in display yet fragile beneath the skin. The Tudor propaganda machine had laboured tirelessly to portray Edward as a second Josiah, a boy king destined to purify religion and secure England's Protestant future. The sermons preached after his death emphasised his piety, his intellect, his supposed vigour, and his role as God's chosen instrument, but the physical evidence contradicted every word. The autopsy, quietly recorded and then suppressed, told another story, a child whose lungs were dissolved, whose heart was bloated and scarred, whose body had broken down years before his death. To see Edward truthfully was to confront the reality that the dynasty Henry VIII had risked everything to secure was as fragile as the body of his son, as doomed as the organs that disintegrated inside him. The metaphor was undeniable. Edward's corpse was the Tudor state in microcosm, a kingdom outwardly powerful but inwardly corrupted, destined to implode under the weight of its contradictions. The political aftermath of Edward's death mirrored the grotesque state of his body. The succession device he had been forced to sign collapsed within days. Lady Jane Grey's 9-day reign swept aside by the fury of a people unwilling to accept such manipulation. Mary Tudor ascended the throne, reversing Edward's Protestant reforms and earning the epithet Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants. The stability Edward was meant to secure dissolved instantly, replaced by chaos, executions, and fear. It was as though the corruption that had consumed his body had seeped into the body politic, spreading infection through the kingdom, undoing what little had been achieved in his short reign. His rotting body had been hidden, but the rot it symbolized could not be concealed. For those who had attended him, the trauma lingered long after the coffin was sealed. Servants who had changed his linens spoke years later of nightmares in which they heard the sound of his rattling breath or smelled again the stench of his chamber. Physicians who had recorded his decline in coded notes abandoned practice soon after, unable to face illness again without recalling the spectacle of a boy's body consumed alive. Even hardened courtiers admitted, in private correspondence written decades later, that what they had witnessed during Edward's final months had shaken their faith not only in monarchy, but in Providence itself. How could a child chosen by God to rule be left to suffer so cruelly? How could the dynasty that had torn England apart for his sake end with a coffin sealed in lead, guarded against its own corruption? Historians in later centuries struggled with Edward's legacy. Some tried to preserve the official myth, describing him as a saintly child who died a holy death, his suffering redeemed by the purity of his faith. Others, more honest, recognized that his decline revealed the limits of power, the futility of ambition, the way in which politics feeds upon even the weakest vessels. Modern medicine has confirmed that tuberculosis was almost certainly the killer, perhaps combined with congenital weakness or kidney disease. But to focus solely on the medical truth is to miss the larger meaning. Edward was not only a victim of disease, he was a victim of expectation, of myth, of the relentless demands of monarchy. His body carried not just illness, but the impossible burden of a dynasty's survival. And under that weight, it collapsed. The metaphor is haunting. Henry VIII had sought immortality through a son. What he received was mortality incarnate. A boy who embodied not strength but fragility. Not triumph, but collapse. Edward's reign, lasting barely 6.5 years, was not a period of greatness, but of denial, of painted portraits that lied, of proclamations that deceived, of courtiers who manipulated a child gasping for breath. His body, hidden in lead, symbolized the dynasty itself, magnificent on the outside, rotting on the inside, and the silence that followed his burial was less reverence than relief. A desperate attempt to bury not only a king, but the truth of what he revealed about the Tudors. Perhaps this is why his tomb has never been opened. Requests to examine his remains have been refused for centuries, officially on grounds of respect, but perhaps also because the monarchy fears what confirmation might bring. If the coffin were unsealed, if the remains of Edward VI were examined with modern tools, they might reveal not only the extent of his suffering, but the lie upon which Tudor myth was built. The boy who was meant to secure a dynasty might instead prove, even in death, that the dynasty was doomed from the start. Better, then, to leave him undisturbed, to let the lead coffin remain silent, to allow the myth to stand unchallenged, however false it may be. And so Edward remains, sealed in his tomb at Westminster Abbey, his body long gone to dust, his story lingering as both warning and metaphor. His life reminds us that power cannot shield against mortality, that ambition cannot prevent decay, that the most gilded throne cannot prevent the collapse of flesh. The boy king who rotted alive became the embodiment of a kingdom itself, one that dressed itself in grandeur while hiding its fragility, one that proclaimed strength while trembling beneath the surface. Edward's reign was not a triumph, but a cautionary tale, and his corpse, hidden in darkness, remains the truest monument to Tudor England's contradictions. And so, dear listener, as we close this story of Edward VI, we find ourselves not in the glittering halls of power, but in the quiet shadows where truth lingers. Unspoken yet undeniable, the boy king who was meant to save a dynasty instead became its mirror, showing England what it most wished to deny, that no throne is stronger than the body that sits upon it, and no ambition can outpace mortality. His short life, filled with suffering and silence, reminds us that even the most powerful families are as fragile as their weakest child. As you rest tonight, carry with you not the horror of Edward's decline, but the lesson hidden within it, that strength is not measured by crowns or signatures, but by compassion, by honesty, by the willingness to face truth, even when it is painful. Let the story of the rotting prince settle in your mind like a candle flickering low, a reminder that history is not always triumph, but often tragedy, and that within tragedy lies the wisdom to live gently, humbly, and with gratitude for the fleeting health and peace we so often take for granted. Sleep now, with the past behind you, and may your dreams be lighter than the burdens carried by kings.